Hello folks, I'm Dave. I've been at AWS for about 16 months now, but doing security for a couple of decades longer than that. I'm not quite up to my quarter century, but that'll be coming very soon. As Ian was saying, Bertram and I have a remit that spans all of EMEA, Europe, Middle East and Africa. But in practice for me, that tends to mean, that tends to come down to the square mile, Docklands and Westminster, at least 90% of the time. So it's good to be up here in Manchester, especially as I grew up about 30 miles south of here. So as Ian was saying earlier, we do have a considerable culture of innovation at AWS. And one of the biggest perks of working here actually is the fact that I get access to what could arguably be said to be the world's biggest lab. And yeah, I'm still inventing stuff. Been around the block a few times, certainly bearing in mind how long I've been doing this stuff. So if you pick an industry, I've probably done projects in it, and I see and deal with customers in AWS customers who essentially span the whole gamut of industry, all the way from manufacturing, media, comms, public sector, you get the idea. Everyone seems to be getting on with this. So actually, a quick show of hands. How many people in the room would say that their principal role in work is concentrated around security? Quite a few, okay. Now, bearing in mind also the show of hands that Ian had earlier, and the fact that we've got people who are both seasoned AWS customers and just starting out, there's no better place to start than the beginning. But bear in mind that there are some extra subtleties that have come along that will keep some of you more advanced customers interested as well. So AWS really does span the globe these days. This map isn't perfectly current in that in January we launched our, oh it is actually, yes, we actually put Seoul on the map. That actually went online in January. And as you may have read in the press, there's 4 new regions that are expecting to be built and up and running fairly shortly. So there's one coming in India, there's one coming in Ohio, there's trying to remember, yeah, there's a second one in China, and perhaps most interestingly for you guys, there's one coming in the UK, which should be up and running end of this year or start of next. I actually got the opportunity back in October to have a brief chat with the chap who decides where our data centers get located, and he says that the locations have been selected and work's underway. So how these actually break down, a region is normally outside of the US, where things tend to go by state level granularity. A region is essentially a set of data centers in separate clusters, which are availability zones, more on which very shortly, that is essentially in a metropolitan area. So in the EU, we've got one in and around Dublin, and we've got another one in and around Frankfurt. These are devolved into availability zones, which are little clusters of data centers, one or more, separated by an appropriate distance that they don't have physically overlapping threat profiles. So we're talking about different floodplains. We're talking about not being under the same aviation flight path, for example. We're also talking about different upstream network providers and different power providers. So you can do resilience within a region by using multiple availability zones, and we highly recommend that you do. There are some customers who also choose to do remote replication between regions in the event of there being some kind of civil contingencies level disaster that, well, it would need a significant civil contingencies level disaster to take a region out. But people need to do it either for their own peace of mind or more commonly for compliance reasons. So data stays where you actually put it, but you can move it where you between regions if you want to, just by issuing a few API calls. And if you want to do Dublin to Frankfurt replication, which some of our customers do, over the Amazon WAN, that tends to be 22 milliseconds as the packet flies round trip. That's what I measured it at the other week anyway. So we have a global footprint, which not only includes our regions, but also includes our CloudFront endpoints. So these are edge locations for our content delivery network, CloudFront, which also hosts Route 53, which is our global, highly available, high speed actually in terms of responsiveness and time to live DNS service. So that actually fronts up lots of our customers' services. It also incorporates a domain registrar service if you actually want to start from scratch and go registering your domains with us. So you put all those together, we're doing pretty well when it comes to coverage. CloudFront also, it isn't just a one-size-fits-all. You can actually set things up so that you can use different subsets of endpoints. So you can just choose to have the Americas, or you can choose to have Europe, or you can put the whole thing together and go global. So it's very, very easy to go into having a global content distribution system and global presence very fast indeed. So all told, it works out at 12 regions, 33 availability zones, 54 edge locations, and no shortage of active customers, but more are always welcome. And we keep piling kit in order to support them. So data stays where you put it, and you choose where to put it. Now, doing compliance as I do wind up spending quite a bit of time talking with and especially listening to our legal team. So I'm going to choose my words very carefully here and have a little bit of an aside. We do get customers, especially in Germany, Bertram knows this more than I do, who sort of go rhubarb, safe harbor, rhubarb. Now, obviously, the ECJ have made their views clear about safe harbor and its suitability from a European perspective. We continue to maintain our safe harbor certification because obviously lots of our customers in Australasia and the Far East and South America and so forth still consider safe harbor to be suitable. However, we did something interesting May last year before the ECJ statement that is actually well worth knowing about. So the EU have a working group called the Article 29 Working Group, and they produce this set of working recommendations and guidelines that they call model clauses. These tend to get put into things that some customers demand in the EU called a data processor agreement. Now, processing, from the perspective of this piece of legislation and set of requirements, is actually computing stuff, storing stuff, moving stuff around. So it really is a very broad brush. We quite recently, as well as issuing as well as negotiating data processor agreements with some of our customers who specifically stated they needed them, we've recently produced a standard template version of our EU data processor agreement that anyone who's got an AWS account can actually access from inside that account just via the web console. So if you grab yourselves a copy of that, run it by your legal team. If they are happy with it, sign it, return it to us. That actually puts the data processor agreement in place, which places a requirement on us to process your data, no matter where it be in the world, in a manner which meets the requirements, as we ran this by appropriate government people when we were actually producing the agreement document, meets the requirements of the Article 29 Working Group model clauses. So if your data needs to be managed to EU standards because of your own business or your customers, it can be done. So a thing that you've probably heard some things about already to varying degrees is our shared responsibility model. This is something that we've had for a long time, actually. Since AWS started, we needed this in terms of defining who actually manages which elements of the full stack that, that your customers wind up using. And you've probably seen this picture a fair few times on our website and in some of our documents. Early on in AWS's life, it was fairly generally applicable, but as we keep adding more services, there are now some more subtle differences for different kinds of service, and this is actually worth going through. So it's a bit more subtle now than this single picture is able to show, although all the elements remain as they are. So back when NIST made their definition of what cloud computing looked like, they split things down into infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. We see things slightly differently, so we've got infrastructure, container, and abstract, but our view and NIST's view aren't that different from each other. So if you look at infrastructure services, where probably the poster child is EC2, our compute service, we look after all the actual core infrastructure in terms of physical environment and networking between them. We then stick a whole ton of compute and storage in them. Database there refers primarily to our account management system and also what we wind up doing and exposing some of to you for identity and access management. And we also look after the networking so that within an availability zone, you just see a contiguous sea of layer 2. We also put our identity and access management piece on the side. I like to draw analogies actually when I talk about certain AWS services. I think IAM looks a lot like Linux role-based access control writ large, in that you have users, groups and roles and fine-grained permissions that go on those, but I don't want to steal Bertram's thunder from his presentation that's coming up later. You then have a shared responsibility demarcation line. So we manage all the bits and pieces down here, you manage what goes on top. That is also not only a demarcation line for responsibility, it's a demarcation line for visibility as well, in that for the most part, you, the customer, don't get to see the deep detail of what goes on down here. We just present you interfaces to use. That can be important for some considerations, and I'll be coming on to a bit more detail there. So in EC2, you get a hypervisor, you install an operating system on it, your root, and at which point you just treat it like any other regular computer inside the instance, so you look after the platforms on top. You also need to use identity and access management to assign permissions and roles to individuals who you want to be able to use the AWS API to affect the operation of the service that you've just stood up. You need to manage the encryption of your data and obviously the content itself in terms of who gets access to it, how it gets backed up, what other controls are around it. So in terms of responsibilities, we look after all these bits, you look after all these bits for regular EC2. Note in particular high availability and scaling. That's something that you need to configure, but in EC2 particularly, there are some features that have come along fairly recently so that you can have your instances get health checked, and in the event of a health check failing, EC2 can automatically restart them for you, but it's something that you do need to set up. Also, of course, you get you actually get to deal with the network protection around your instances. A security group actually is a full layer 3 stateful inspection firewall. you wind up getting one automatically per instance. And the neat thing about this, in terms of IAM as well, is that you can continue to maintain separation of duty between your network and your server teams if you want to. So you can actually have your server team manage your server, but have your network team, or indeed your security team, manage the typical firewall rules as to what's able to access that server and what that server is able to access. Going on to container services, we've talked about these bits already. We move the line of demarcation up a little bit. So we actually manage the operating system and we manage the application on top. Some benefits of this is that you don't need to worry about operating system patching anymore. We cover that. Similarly, probably the poster child for our container service is RDS, which is our relational database service, on top of which you can run a whole bunch of database engines from Oracle through MySQL, Postgres, our new Aurora system, which is MySQL compatible. There's a couple more as well, MariaDB and Microsoft SQL Server. We continue to provide IAM. You get to manage your firewall rules still, and you get to manage encryption, access to the ability to configure the system, and your content. So in an RDS world, I find that the most succinct way to actually express where the line of demarcation sits is for any Oracle DBAs in the room. You get DBA, we get sysDBA. Also, as part of this, as part of our management of the actual underlying database service, we can, if you want to, and you can configure this at database instance stand-up time, we can, if you want to, also during the configured management time windows that you need in the RDS service, actually patch your database service to bring it up to the latest version as and when new versions come out and we approve them for use. Now, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. If you have applications that have dependency on a particular database engine version, you can hold things so that we don't do that patching until the time where that database engine version is going out of support, at which point we will politely ask you to upgrade things that have dependencies on it so you can move your database onto the next version. Also worth bearing in mind here is now we've moved up a bit, we manage high availability. One of the things that I did shortly after I joined AWS, I'd been at Sun for many years before then, and obviously spent quite a bunch of time building two-node database clusters on Solaris with Oracle on top. I tended to find that to build a proper two-node cluster and secure it and do all the testing typically took me about a fortnight, working reasonably hard. So I did some poking around. I stood an RDS Oracle instance up, and it was a bit of a penny dropping moment when it started saying, "Hello, talk PLSQL to me," after 10 minutes. But with high availability, again, if you've built any database clusters yourselves manually, you'll know how much fun it is dealing with things like quorum devices and terminal servers and so forth. Again, that's something that you don't need to do in an AWS world. Under the lid, we actually use the Paxos algorithm to do synchronous state replication between our database nodes, and that's something that there was a session on at our reInvent Summit in 2013, if you want to go looking it up. A neat thing about reInvent, if it turns out that you can't get there, by the way, is that all the breakout sessions do actually get videoed, and we tend to put them up on YouTube. Hey, Google are nice like that, providing some web-based services. So the final piece of the jigsaw in terms of service definitions is our abstract services, where we literally manage everything except your data and its encryption. So plus of course elements of the access to that data. So the top bit of the IAM rectangle up there should probably be blue, strictly speaking, in that you do still get to configure in IAM who gets to affect the operation of the service and access to the content. So poster child for this is our S3 service, which, as Ian was saying earlier, we launched 10 years ago this week. It's nice, actually, that the AWS anniversary and Pi Day happened to fall coincidentally. So we manage well nigh everything, and you just look after your data and how it actually gets protected and who gets access to it. So if you put all these three together, you get a nice sliding scale of the things that you need to look after versus what we look after, and also the things that you get to see and affect. So thinking about choices of service, if we consider RDS as mentioned, you do not get to see what goes on, for example, at shell level in the Linux instance that happens to be holding your Oracle database up. If there is a particular governance or compliance need why you need those logs, you can still get the database level logs out of RDS, of course, because you are DBA. But there are some circumstances in which it may be necessary for you to take a step back to a different class of service and then build something on it yourself. So, for example, if you need those logs from the underpinning Linux instance on your database, you would probably need to actually build a database out on top of EC2 where you would be able to get access to that by virtue of being root on the instances. There's a little bit of swings and roundabouts in all this, but obviously customers, well, a lot of customers wanted to have a managed database service. We heard them, we built it. Similarly, when it comes on to compliance requirements, which Ian mentioned briefly, we do on the aws.amazon.com/compliance page make information available about what services are in scope for which certifications. Now, an example here is our ECS service, Elastic Container Service, which is essentially managed Docker. That currently isn't in scope for our certifications yet. We do our audit cycles at the rate at which we need to do them to maintain compliance. So for PCI, that's an annual thing, and the report normally comes out September-ish. SOC reports normally come out October-ish as well. So if you need to run a Docker service, but you need it to be in a particular compliance scope, then you would need to go take EC2 and install Docker on it yourself, and then have the discussion with your auditors, more on which in just a moment. So security that we actually do, we look after all the stuff that most people consider to be fairly dull and routine, so that you, the customer, can concentrate on the interesting bits that define your business. Like Ian, I spent a lot of my time down in this world securing it all. So in terms of the scopes you need to consider, if you were building everything yourself or running your own data centers, then you need to start from the concrete floor upwards. In fact, you actually need to start from the underfloor cabling upwards. So you need to get your own auditors in to look after all this. You need to actually deal with all those audit reports and getting them commissioned. You need to essentially get the auditors in to do their thing. And one thing that can be said actually about the fact that AWS has as many regions and availability zones as it does, then certainly when you get onto our SOC reports, which are very much spread over time rather than point in time in the way that PCI and ISO are, it's fair to say that because there's so many sites involved, most working days of the year, somewhere in an AWS data center, there is an external auditor doing their job. So audits are really a fact of life for us. Whereas if you run on us, you start with the baseline of accredited services, being a baseline from which you then build on top. And everything that we do to satisfy the requirements of our most demanding customers from a security and compliance perspective benefits everyone. So it doesn't matter the size of your company, you still get the same enterprise-grade security that we give everyone. Also, of course, what we do in terms of interesting inventions actually helps drive into that compliance as well. Some of the standards bodies we have good discussions with as well. So the rising tide floats all boats, as they say. We have, as Ian was saying, we have a base set of 1,800 and something security controls. And the way in which we get our external certifications is that, well, all our external certifications, like most of what we do, is driven directly by customer demand. So in the event that you need to get a particular certification that we don't already have, by all means talk to us, register the requirement, and then as demand necessitates, we can look at that standard. We can make a mapping between our own internal set of controls and the controls that the standard requires, and we can then get the auditors in. Another thing worth bearing in mind is that while some of our certifications, in particular FedRAMP, are only applicable to specific regions, so FedRAMP is really the odd one out. Most of our certifications do apply globally. Obviously, there are some like well, FedRAMP being the case in point, that only apply to data centers on US soil. But we do actually run all our regions globally identically, in as much as we can, subject to the requirements of law and compliance. So classic case in point here. Within the EU, we're required to only keep our data center CCTV footage for 30 days. The rest of the world is happy for us to keep them for 90, so we do. And Steve Schmidt, our Chief Information Security Officer, has said that to actually take all the operational guides that we derive from our master control set and make the change to deal with the CCTV delta, then go on picking things all the way up the chain until we can put the exception in the master control set. It's a bit like pulling teeth. So it's actually easier for us to run everything the same everywhere. So in as much as we can, we do. Because of the fact that we actually don't need to look at your data to do what we do, we just build the platform that you run on top of. You retain full ownership and control of your data, and using identity and access management, you get, plus of course the controls that you're able to put in your EC2 instances or at database level in RDS or other similar services, you get to manage who gets to do what with what. And as Ian has already showed, we are able to derive a whole bunch of interesting controls from our main set. So as well as HIPAA that Ian mentioned for the US, our GovCloud region covers ITAR. We meet Cloud Security Alliance requirements. If you get, if you like the CSA cake as a questionnaire regarding cloud security capability, we do have our answer to the cake in our risk and compliance white paper, which I would encourage you to read. We also meet requirements in Australia for financial services. FedRAMP I've already mentioned. We are also on GovCloud, which of course is more of a procurement framework, but with pre-certification, as Ian was saying. So even the UK government is starting to move to a cloudy way of thinking in many ways. Now, we do what we do down at our level below the shared responsibility demarcation, getting all these certifications. How does this affect what you need to do above that line in order to get certification yourself? Well, ultimately, what needs to happen is that if you need to get a particular certification, you still need to get your own auditor in and convince them that the environment you have built on top of our environment meets the compliance requirements. At which point, an enlightened and pragmatic auditor will then be able to take our own audit reports, and we do make our SOC 1 and SOC 2 and PCI DSS audit reports available under NDA. They're Type 2 reports as well, so they include a free-form letter from the auditor about what they think broadly about our operational technologies and procedures, as well as just going through all the usual checklists, which is why they're NDA documents. Stitch the two together and say, okay, I am now happy with the compliance of this whole stack, I'm going to sign the thing off. So you still need to build the right shape of thing on top to satisfy your auditor. And we recognise that because we have a whole slew of features in our services, and we take a very Unix-like approach to control and trust, in that we trust you customers to know what you're doing with your services, so you can potentially do really, really clever things that we might scratch our heads at because you're expert in your business, we know ours. But we decided that we wanted to make it easier for some customers, especially those who are just starting out, to build compliant environments on top of AWS. So we came up with a project that has gone through various names. The one that it first saw public light of day as was Goldbase, so you may still see reference to that name around, but it seems to be settling on security by design. So if you want to go building a secure and compliant environment, obviously start with requirements capture and documentation. Documentation sets are one of the core things that all auditors wind up looking at. Then go build yourself a reference environment. So build your EC2 instances out, and then populate them as needed, and then snapshot them as AMIs, Amazon Machine Images, that you can then deploy reproducibly across all your environments. And you can then go actually automating the rest of the environment using templates such as CloudFormation primarily. The way I look at CloudFormation is very much like, think of it as being like Linux Kickstart, but at cloud scale. So you actually wind up defining scripts that give you the means of building out virtual private clouds and configuring firewalls and network access control lists on subnets that all get built out of the result of a great big JSON script. And then you can actually do validation checks on that, not only with your auditors to determine that they're happy with them, but also with CloudFormation, as well as building environments from a CloudFormation template. You can also do a Delta check to determine whether what you've actually got deployed in your estate actually matches what was in the template that you may have originally deployed it with. So you can do an immediate point check as to what any differences might be. So we started off the Goldbase project. Our aim is to publish a whole set of assets in terms of CloudFormation templates, modularized and templatized, as I'll be going into in just a moment, to meet the requirements of specific standards. We started out with NIST 853, mostly in fact, because of the number of requests for such a thing we had from our friends over the other side of the Atlantic. But also, it happens that NIST 853, for anyone who's actually looked at it, is a pretty big and pretty comprehensive control framework. So we figured that if we started here, then a lot of what came out of it would be reusable. We published the asset sets for this in January. They're freely downloadable, so stick AWS NIST 853 in your favorite search engine and you'll get to the right white paper and asset set. but we are going to be working through a bunch of these to essentially produce asset sets for a whole bunch more standards. I understand PCI DSS is the next one being worked on, though I don't have a launch date for it. So as well as diagrams and documentation to incorporate into your documentation set that you'll need for your auditors, we've gone and produced some CloudFormation templates. Now, CloudFormation, for anyone who is familiar with Linux Kickstart, is, as well as being a very powerful framework, it's a framework that you need to impose your own structure upon. If you don't actually impose your own structure, it's very easy to get into the trap of having a base of code that becomes difficult to maintain. So we've come up with a template framework for CloudFormation that is modular and allows you to go plugging in specific snippets of code for specific aspects of your service and indeed specific types of assets. So the aim is that if you take the base framework and plug in the snippets that you need, that will actually build an environment that you can be confident will pass an audit against the standard involved. So obviously there's documentation for all this online. There's currently two main gold-based white papers, an introduction and a practice guide, plus there's going to be white papers accompanying each of the asset sets for a particular standard regarding how to use them. While we go working through this project and producing asset sets, in the meantime, there's also workbooks that we've produced not only ourselves but also with third parties in order to go about meeting particular compliance standards. I would actually recommend, if you want to get more fine-grained detail about exactly how the shared responsibility model breaks down for specific services, I'd actually recommend picking up the IT Grundschutz workbook. It is in English, but I happen to think it's rather well written from the point of view of showing that particular breakdown. I would also recommend the CESG UK Security Principles document, where we answer point by point the requirements that CESG have on cloud providers in the UK. And that also contains what I think is a particularly detailed view of how we deal with things like incident response. Speaking as I was earlier about things like our PCI audit reports, even if you aren't involved in processing credit card data yourselves, the PCI audit report, as well as the SOC reports, is worth having, because it doesn't just cover the details of processing credit card data, but it also covers important things like how we go about helping you respond to any forensic investigation requirements if those are needed. Short version on the forensic requirements, we do. We make a point of being as helpful as we can on the subject. But there's white papers on all sorts of particular topics. EU data protection is going to be relevant for quite a few of you, I would expect. The risk and compliance white paper, if part of your normal mode of operation involves sending security questionnaires to people to assess their capabilities, we do actually answer the Cloud Security Alliance CAKE, plus there's an Australian financial services one, and also I seem to recall the Motion Picture Associates of America security questionnaires all embedded in here. So it's actually a good first place to start when it comes to garnering answers to those kinds of questions. And we also recently launched some training initiatives. So there's a free 3-hour online course on security fundamentals, and there's also a new 3-day course, classroom-based. Also on Quick Labs, there's a whole bunch of security and auditing labs. And as was announced the other day, to celebrate our 10th anniversary, Quick Labs Access, I believe, has become free for the rest of the month. Free for the rest of the month, says Ian. So take advantage of that while it's available. All these slides are going to be made available to you as PDFs after the event, so there's no need to actually be rapidly scribbling URLs down. But here's a few URLs as to useful places to visit when it comes to answering security questions that you may have immediately as a result of this. But of course, we're all going to be available during the breaks and lunch. Please feel free to collar us with interesting questions. And finally, when it comes to questions about compliance standards that you may need that we haven't actually got in our portfolio yet, this is the place to go, or talk to your account managers for those of you who have them. So with that, on to Ian and IAM.